So when was the last time you argued about the proper skin color of elves, or told someone they're not a real fan because they hadn't read a specific book? Well, I sure hope you enjoyed your authoritarian moment, because that's what it was. That's right, everybody, we'll be pulling out the big guns today because we're talking about canons and why they suck. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about book-adjacent things, and today we'll be talking about the dreaded canon. What I mean by that is a lot of things, and I'll explain them in a moment, but until then, well, if you're new here, welcome. I talk about books sometimes, and sometimes about other things, and if you're here for a while, thanks for sticking with me. If you enjoyed here, like, subscribe, comment, share. I'll certainly give you reasons to be angry at me and yell at me in the comments, so that's something, isn't it? And if you really want to help me out, there's a Patreon, and there's a current GoFundMe, because I'm kind of fucked financially. Anyway, thanks for doing all of these things, and let's start talking about canon, shall we? Alright, let's begin with a quick admonition. I will be talking about why canon is bad, or canons are bad. That does not mean that any individual book or other text considered part of a specific canon is bad in itself. You can enjoy all of those. I don't care. It's about the structure that we're talking about today. And that's where we start, with a definition. What's canon actually mean? Well, it comes from the Greek, and if I could actually read, I would, cite a dictionary or something. But it comes from Greek, canon, and it means rules, or a set of rules, or a rule. And that's where the big trouble starts, because rules are sort of objective. Well, they're not, but they bring that atmosphere of objectivity. And that's at the core of it. Now, historically, we have used canons for a lot of things. One of those is, of course, the Bible. See, at some point, a bunch of rich white dudes, well, sort of medieval and Mediterranean white dudes, or Mediterranean dudes, sat down and decided which books belong into the Bible and which don't. And then people have been arguing about that ever since. And unless you have Maccabee 1 and 2 in your Bible, you're not good. I'm just telling you. Anyway, my point is that it started out with a list of texts that are considered part of the Bible, and that's one version of canon. Now, that was important in a way, because it meant that books that were considered canon got copied more when, we still copied books by hands. So, one version of canon. Another version of canon is canon law. See, in medieval times, people started to talk about what is proper behavior in the church, what is proper belief, how you behave, and so forth. And people made judgments, and they got collected, and they were turned into canon law, which is the official church law. Now, if you feel really frisky, you can go down to your library and get a collection of canones, which is those judgments from different church councils and stuff like that. They're huge books. I recommend you don't do that unless you really want to read a lot of boring Latin about which people are supposed to wear which mark on their clothing because they're heretics, Jews, or anything of that sort. And yeah, it's church law. So there is the idea of canonic law, which is, once again, a collection of rules. Those are historical versions, but let's talk about what we mean by canon nowadays. And there is, in fact, two versions of canon that I want to talk about today. I'll call one of them, intellectual property canon, and I'll call one of those, cultural canon. And they are connected, but they're also somewhat different, or at least seem to be somewhat different, and I'll explain why they're actually not. Now, let's start with the cultural canon. A cultural canon is a list of, artifacts, pieces of art, whatever you want to call it, we'll call them texts today, that are considered to have defined a specific culture. There is, for example, what you might call fantasy canon. It will probably include Conan the Barbarian, hopefully, if people actually know their shit. It will probably include Lord of the Rings. It'll include stuff like maybe Wheel of Time, if people, it belongs there. It's a list of books that people would consider define the fantasy genre. Now, there's obviously other forms of canon. There is what you might call a feminist canon. It's a collection of books that define, the female experience in a way. There are other versions of canon. And the big one is, of course, the Western canon. That's, the idea that there are a bunch of texts that have defined Western culture. I'm pretty sure there's other sort of national or whatever you want to call them, cultural canons out there, but the Western one is the one where the problem shows itself the clearest. Now, the Western canon has been something that we've talked about a lot in Western society. It's all about the texts that made us the West. And when we talk about the West, we usually mean the best guys around, or at least the guys that managed to actually beat down everyone else. That's what it boils down to. And, it usually starts with something Greek. If you're a bit less primitive, it sometimes starts with something like Gilgamesh and things like that, and it moves all the way to the present, or at least something ending around the year 1900, because then dreaded modernity strikes and it leads to the decline of the West, or something like that. And from what I've just said, you probably already figured out why I think it's bullshit. See, the whole idea of such a canon is to define a specific culture in a very specific form and explain why it is superior to other cultures. It also makes it very clear that only people that have partaken of that specific canon, read those texts and so forth, are worth to be part of the cool kids, so to speak. And what that does is it pushes people that either are not part of that culture because they haven't read those texts, or because they don't fit other aspects of what is, considered that culture. It pushes those to the side. And what that means it pushes those to the margins. It marginalizes them. And that's where the whole thing becomes problematic. Now, there have been a lot of Western canons. I guess the most famous one is the one of Harold Bloom, who wrote a book in 1995 called The Western Canon, where he collects hundreds of books and says this is what made the West. It's the question that we will come back to is why does anyone care? And that's what lies at the root of it. But so much for what you will call a cultural canon. It's a list of texts that define, or a list of rules that defines an in-group and an out-group. And the goal for that is, of course, to make, the in-group cool and the rest, oppressed, marginalized, and pushed out of, a privileged situation. So let's move on to the intellectual property canon. The intellectual property canon is what you probably thought of when I said canon for the first time. It is, something comic book nerds talk about all the time. It's those kind of questions like, which part of a larger intellectual property universe is actually official and which part is not? That's what I would call intellectual property canon. So, why is it, what does it do, and why is it wrong? See, once we started to come up with ideas like copyright, which took a long time, it starts in the 19th century, there is the question who gets to decide what belongs to a story and what doesn't? Before that, we had, of course, legends, mythologies, and people were adding adventures to, the Arthurian canon, the Arthurian legends, or all kinds of stories. People were talking about, is this official or not? In fact, if you want to talk about a version before copyright existed, go read Don Quixote and maybe read alternative versions that were published between Don Quixote Part 1 and 2. That's exactly what we're talking about. People took stories, took tales, took texts, and did their own thing with it. Nowadays, we call it fan fiction. But before there was, copyright law, there was no such thing as fan fiction. But after that, we had copyright law, and that means someone gets to decide what's part of the game and what is not. They get to set the rules. In theory and ideally, that is the original author of a specific story. But in practice, it's the people who, inherited that right, or bought that right, or, pirated that right, depending on where you're at. And those people get to decide what is official and what is not. And the question is why are they doing that, and what's their motives? Well, not too big of a surprise, their motive is, of course, money. Because, they're talking about copyright and the idea of who gets to actually market that stuff. And that starts with, Sometimes the estate of an author publishing books posthumously, and the question is like, did the author actually want that, or did they actually hold back from publication because they didn't feel they were up to snuff or whatever? And then you move on to copyright holders deciding that they allow someone else to write a further novel set in a beloved, intellectual property. For example, write another Oz book after L. Frank Baum died, or maybe write another Hitchhiker's Guide Through the Galaxy book after Douglas Adams died. And because they own the copyright, they get to say these are official. And then you move on to, say, comic book universes or stuff like that, where people decide to at some point say, well, you know what? That story that got published 50 years ago, that's no longer official. That's apocryphal, if you want to use the religious term. And that's where all the trouble starts. Because once again, what canon means is a set of rules that decides what is official and what is not. And the authority that, defines that is the people who all hold the copyright and, the power of the legal system behind them. That's all that is. But it has darker consequences because, see, once people change things within a, intellectual property, possibly after the writer has died in, say, the world of Tolkien in Middle-earth, or maybe someone sold their rights, like in, say, Star Wars. People that are emotionally invested in those worlds, start arguing about that canon as well. They might even disagree. Let's talk about Rings of Power. See, Rings of Power did have, elves of color. They had people of color play elves, and a lot of people were unhappy with that. But since this is an official licensed product, does this mean black elves are now canon? Some people were arguing against it, and for all kinds of racist reasons. My point, however, is that we're arguing about, rules, and the only thing we can do when we talk about rules is we can, appeal to authority, which is at the core of all these ideas of canon. So, authority, right? Authorities suck. That's just fundamentally the case. However, what we need to understand when we talk about canon is that they are a set of rules that define an in-group and an out-group. And usually, they are made by someone who either has an established authority, either because of the legal system or because of, their reputation that they built up through some things, and they get to decide who gets to play with them and whom they want to kick out. And that means it's about prejudice. In the case of, say, Harold Bloom creating a Western canon, it's his personal prejudices, which we are rather conservative if you look at the list, and include a lot of writers of color, female writers, and so forth. In the case of, Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, it's, the motives there are more like what does sell at what point, because that's the only motive corporations or copyright holders have under capitalism at the end of the day. And people might disagree with that. But at the end of the day, and this is what I mean, these rules are always used to put people down, to exclude people, and the question is why? Because, see, these authorities, they are arbitrary. There is no objective reason why Harold Bloom has the right to decide what makes the Western canon. There is nothing beyond, legal fiction that explains why the Tolkien estate gets to decide whether elves are allowed to be black or not. This is just made-up fiction. And us arguing about that, possibly even appealing to the authority of Tolkien never wrote about black elves. Which part of Tolkien do you mean? The published books? Does the Silmarillion count? You don't know, because you need to make this up. And you make this up to suit your own ideas, and your own ideals and ideologies, and your own worldview. And then you appeal to authority afterwards. And you know what? That's lame. So, do canons actually work? They work if you want to put people down, if you want to, build up and shore up your privilege, and if you want to marginalize people. That's what canons are about to do in fiction and, as cultural canons, most of the time. And fans doing that arguing for the holders of an intellectual property are actually just doing the dirty work for the man And the man in this case is usually old, white, and male, which is why I'm attacking them, because I'm going to be one of those at some point, and I want to be the field to be clear, so I can actually enjoy all of it. Anyway, let's move on and see if all is lost, or if there are situations where making these kinds of lists is actually useful. Canons, what are they good for? Well, they're good for nothing, but building lists of texts is something that makes sense. See, if you want to figure out how did fantasy end up being the way it is today, for example. You might want to look into what inspired your favorite authors. You might want to look into what inspired your favorite authors, and so forth, and figure out how a specific tradition built up a school, so to be. It's almost like a magic school, but without the transphobia and all the stuff. And that's one reason to build these lists. Maybe just don't call them canon. You might call them, well, the genealogy of fantasy, or the fantasy genre. Or you got to teach a specific field of literature. And in order to make this work, make this comparable to other people teaching the same kind of thing, you might sit down and say, like, this is the 5 books that we'll teach about and talk about this year. And you can call this a syllabus, or you can call it a curriculum. And that works as well. But don't pretend that there is some idea, some objective idea from all the way up there that tells us that these are the books we got to read, or these are the rules. They're not. You made them up. We made them up. I make them up. And that's one reason. Another reason where something like a canon, or what you might want to call a list of books you want to read, comes in handy, is of course if you want to communicate with people. See, art is never just about sitting at home and appreciating it on your own. It is a social activity. Reading is a social activity. You sit at home, you read your book, and then you talk to other people. But what you need for that is other people to have read the same kind of books, which is a struggle, let me tell you. And that's where, creating lists of hey, if you want to talk with me about books, maybe read these books. And I'll read the books that you think I should read, and then we'll sit down and have a talk. That's where these kind of lists come in. But at that point, the authority is all yours or mine. I make up a list of things I love, and then I tell everyone to read them, and then we can talk about it. And someone else does the same thing, and I'll read it, and then we can talk about it. But it's not an objective outside authority. And not having read those texts does not mean you're not cool. It just means we have less to talk about. And I think that changes the whole image. It changes the approach. Because it's no longer about rules that exclude people. It's about an invitation to join a conversation. And that's a very different thing. And unfortunately, I feel we need to drop the term canon, because canon is tied to that pseudo-objectivity, to those made-up authorities and those rules that exclude people. So maybe we should drop the term and just talk about the books we love, and maybe figure out which books made us the people that we are. And that's all I have to say for today. I hope you enjoyed this. If you want to argue with me about the term canon, you can do so in the comments. I do appreciate that. If you like the whole thing, well, I don't know, like the video. If you haven't subscribed yet, maybe do that. If you want to give me money, because I'm poor, all for my own reasons, don't worry. I'm to blame, but I'd still appreciate your help. Join the Patreon, send me some money through PayPal, or, well, join the GoFundMe to help me cover my debt so I can actually start again. Anyway, I wish you all a great Saturday, and I'll see you in the next one, and thanks and cheers, right? Cheers.